The promised land for blacks during the civil rights era was not a literal place they were to move to. There was some like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X who said that we were supposed to make a trip back to the motherland in Africa. But this is not what Dr. King had preached. He didn't believe we had to move somewhere else because this was our place. The promised land at that time represented blacks being able to drink from the same water fountain as their white brothers. The promised land represented being able to use the same bathrooms. The promised land represented being able to sit down and eat at the same restaurant and at the same table and receive the same type of service. The promised land represented being able to live in a time where black people would be treated as equal. They would be treated fair and they would not be prejudged. But they were looked at like the people that they were, and those were children of God. When Dr. King talks about the promised land and he says he's looked over and he's seen it, this is what he sees. And so when you looked, if you have the chance, regardless of what your political affiliation is, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, when you looked at the Democratic National Convention and you saw that there were white men and black men and white women and black men and white women who were there in their 50s, 60s, and 70s and up, and you saw tears coming from their eyes as they saw Senator Obama begin to speak, there were some ignorant newscasters who had declared that they were just caught up in the emotion of this star power that Senator Obama has. But what they did not recognize is that these individuals lived in a time where, let alone a black man could stand before people and speak and run for president, but he couldn't use the same bathroom. And so they were now living in the promised land. And they were seeing the dream that now there was a man being judged by the content of his character and not by the color of his skin. And so the tears began to pour from their eyes as they saw what Dr. King saw not too long ago. Amen. They were at one time at Canaan's edge with Dr. King, but now they are experiencing a part of the promised land, and it does something to them. There's something else, however, about Dr. King's words that also demand our attention from this particular speech. And it is where he says that he has looked over and seen the promised land, but says some very prophetic words. He says, I may not get there with you, but I promise that we will get there as a people. And his words were prophetic in the fact that Dr. King was never to experience all that he saw when he looked into the promised land. For not too long later, you discovered that Dr. King would be assassinated. He would never be able to see all that God would have for his people. He stood at Canaan's edge, but never stepped foot in Canaan. And I discovered that each of us in our lives today, some way, somehow, can relate to the experience of Dr. King. But just like Dr. King, there are too many of us who are simply at Canaan's edge, but never make it into Canaan. For we see the promised land, but we never set foot in it. We see the potential that God has for us, yet we never realize it. We see the place that God wants us to be in our lives, yet we never reach it. We see the type of people that God wants us to become, yet we stay the same. And I don't know about you this morning, but I'm tired of standing on the edges of peace of mind. I want some peace of mind. I'm tired of standing on the edges of a good marriage. I want a good marriage. I'm tired of standing on the edges of my potential. I want to realize my full potential in Jesus Christ. I'm tired of standing on the edges of a Christ-like character. I want my character to be just like Christ. I'm tired of standing on the edge of overcoming depression. I no longer want to be depressed. I'm tired of standing on the edges of being a good father. I want to be the father that God wants me to be. I'm tired of standing on the edges of being the premier church in Lincoln. I want to be the church that God wants us to be. I'm tired of being at Canaan's edge. I'm tired of standing on the edges of what it is that God wants for me. I'm tired of standing on the edges of possibility and potential, but in my life, never realizing that I don't want to be at Canaan's edge. I want to be in Canaan. Now, before we continue, we need to clearly define some terms. Canaan, or the promised land, which we'll use interchangeably, for the children of Israel represented two things. One, that we could call maybe figurative and another literal, although the figurative meaning for the promised land was one that they would realize later when Jesus Christ will come back for the second time to take us all home. But Canaan figuratively at this point, because they obviously were not in heaven, was symbolic there, and this whole journey to Canaan is symbolic of their journey that you and I are making right now to heaven. So Canaan, or the promised land, represented, stay with me now, the place of rest for eternity that one day they all would receive through Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, Hebrews chapter 3 and chapters 4 compares the rest of the promised land and the rest of the Sabbath to the rest that you will get in heaven. And so some of y'all missed that when we talked about on the shaking place. But remember, Hebrews is compared, I don't have time to give it to you, but I got to shout to you real quick, that the rest that you have on the Sabbath is the same type of rest that you get in heaven. Now listen to me carefully. When Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God gave them two things, marriage and the Sabbath. And so what he said is, I know you can't get heaven till I come, but I can give you a piece of it every week. So you see, I don't get bothered when the Sabbath runs in. That's my piece of heaven that God's given me till I get here. But that's a whole other sermon. Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4. Go look at that yourself. You'll see it. You'll see it. But secondly, the promised land represented a literal place for the children of Israel that they could go to, and they would be away from all of those people who were trying to attack them. And if they did try and come in and attack, God had promised that he would always give them a victory. So the promised land for Israel represented the heaven that one day they would get, but it also represented the place that God wanted them in at this moment before they reach heaven. Y'all still with me so far? So when we look at ourselves today, we see that we are spiritual Israels, what the Bible calls us. Therefore, Canaan can represent the same two things for us as well. First, Canaan still represents to us the heaven that we are to receive through Jesus Christ when he comes all to take us home. And I don't know about that, folk, but I get excited when I just start thinking about the fact that God has another place that he's going to take me to. Some of us get comfortable here because I see the cars that we have, I see the houses that we've got, I see the neighborhoods that we live in, but I want to let you know that this place is just a 2-star motel. Are y'all listening to me? And God has got a better place for you. For I want to let you know that I don't know about you, but my feet were not made to walk up and down the raggedy streets of Lincoln, but my feet were made to walk on streets of gold between Hallelujah Boulevard and Praise the Lord Avenue. My body was never meant to wear these cheap suits, but this body was meant to wear a long white robe. My feet were not made to wear floor shine shoes, but they were made for golden slippers. I was not made to come into a place whose building was made by Ayers and Ayers or whatever type of architectural company you can think of, but my home is a place whose builder and maker is God. Heaven is my home. That's where I was created to be. That's where God wants me to be. And by his grace, that's where I'm going to be. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells us in John 14 that he's there preparing mansions for you. And my mother always used to tell me that while he's preparing that place for you, don't disappoint him and make him tear it down. Make sure you occupy that place for you, because he's got it just for you. If that makes sense when you say amen. But not only does Canaan represent our journey that we'll make to heaven one day, but Canaan also represents, I need you to hear me very carefully now, Canaan also represents a place in your life emotionally, physically, and spiritually where you are realizing the potential and all that God has for you while here on earth. Are you listening to me, folks? You see, we get the idea that we are not supposed to have any type of joy or any type of peace while here on earth. That is not true at all. Now, you shouldn't have so much that you want to stay here. Are y'all listening to me? But there is a potential, there are goals, and there is a place in your life that God wants you to be right here on earth before he comes. There's a level of character that he wants you to achieve. There's a level of emotional stability, are you listening to me, that he wants you to have. He doesn't want us losing our mind back and forth. God says, I've got a place of rest and peace in me, and that is your Canaan right now. Are you listening to me? Doesn't mean that folk won't attack, but it means that he will fight your battles. And what we've got to understand is what Jeremiah 29:11 says, for I know the thoughts that I have for you. Or as another version says, for I know the plans that I have for you. Y'all, I need y'all to hear that for a moment. God, with all that he has to do, still has a plan for each of us.